quiet my soul, 'cause you're teaching me how to slow down.
Good morning, River House. Last devotional, we talked about building an altar, which is symbolic for building a life of prayer. And we talked about location, meaning we need to build a physical location where we pray and actually do this physical but prophetic act of building a physical altar, a prayer space, a prayer room, a prayer closet that we frequent in our lives. And this morning, I want to talk about frequency. So it's not enough to just build an altar, to build a physical location. We actually need to frequent this location if we're to successfully live into a life of prayer. And so the fire of God is sovereign, but that does not remove responsibility from our lives, from us, if we're to live a life of fire, which is ultimately a life of prayer is a life of fire. And so God's fire falls sovereignly on people, but we still have a role in positioning ourselves for the fire to fall upon us. Right? We cannot control how or when God's fire comes and when God's fire falls, but we can frequent places where it's known to come. Right? So Moses saw the fire burning on a bush in the wilderness. Right? We can't make bushes burn sovereignly by the fire of God, but we can go and put ourselves, right? We can frequent places where we know that bushes are known to start burning, and we can sit and watch, right? And so the altar is where God's fire falls. We know this, right? So if we want to live a life of fire, we can't control it. We don't pray X amount of hours or X amount of times or in certain ways, and then we can control God's fire coming on us. That's not how it works, right? But we're told, right, that God's fire falls on sacrifice. And when we build an altar, when we build a physical location, right, every time we come and frequent that location, we are placing ourselves as the sacrifice upon the altar. Right, Romans 12 says, I urge you, brothers, by the mercy of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual act of worship. Right, so when we frequent the prayer altar in our lives, we are putting ourselves in a place where God says, I will show up. Right? He may not show up immediately, but he will show up eventually. And there's something about frequency, there's consistency, there's faithfulness, there's perseverance at play here. That when we continue to show up and put ourselves on the altar day after day after day, we're positioning ourselves in a location that God says, my fire will fall on the altar of the Lord and consume a holy sacrifice. You are the sacrifice. I am the sacrifice that God is looking for. And it's not to kill us. Right? It's a living sacrifice. He wants to set us on fire so that we live a life that burns his glory bright into the earth. When I was in Mozambique years ago, Heidi Baker shared with us one day that the first thing that she would pray on many mornings was she would just fall on her face and say, God, I surrender to you today. Here I am. I yield and I surrender my life unto you again. Right? And it's a daily surrender that a life of prayer exudes. It's a daily yielding of ourselves. It's a daily of just getting up on that altar and saying, God, here I am. I want to burn. I want your fire to consume me. Right? And when and how it comes is of God's sovereign choice. But it is our responsibility and our sovereign choice of if we are going to put ourselves on that altar. There were many years ago when I first began in ministry, the senior citizen classroom in the back of the church had an old Amish fireplace, like the fake fire, and an altar in front of that fireplace. And I used to go back because I didn't have a lot to do. I was young in ministry. And I would go back and I would literally physically lay on that altar in front of that cheesy old fireplace. And I would just mumble the same prayer again and again to God, which is, Lord, I want to burn. I want the fire of revival to fall on me. Let your fire fall on me. Let your fire fall on me. Right? God is not looking for complex and theologically extraordinary prayers from his people. He's looking for yielded hearts. He's looking for people who will both build a location of a physical altar, but then frequent that location and say, God, consume me with holy fire. Here I am again today. I yield to you. I surrender to you. Let your fire fall on me. Right? If we will be faithful to frequent the prayer altar in our lives, God will be faithful to fall on us with holy fire and set us ablaze with his glory and use us in ways that we could never ask or imagine. But we have to be faithful to frequent the altar of God in our lives. So hopefully by now you have built an altar in your lives, and I want to encourage you, continue to frequent it. Just keep frequent it. Just keep coming to that place. Even if it's just little 5-minute murmurs throughout the day. Fall on me, God. Don't pass me by. I want your fire to consume me. If you will be faithful to frequent, God will be faithful to fall on you with his divine presence and fill you and empower you to live a life of fire. God bless you this morning, and I pray grace abounds to you as you seek the face of God.
'Cause you're teaching me how to slow